Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History is often told through the lens of those who held the power to write it, leaving behind hidden narratives that challenge conventional wisdom. Among the lesser-known chapters of American history lies the story of Black Native societies, underground alliances between enslaved Africans and indigenous groups that not only provided sanctuary to escapees, but also trained them in the art of warfare. These clandestine networks played an instrumental role in resistance movements across North America and the Caribbean, undermining colonial control and rewriting the fate of countless individuals who dared to defy oppression. While the common narrative of slavery paints a picture of relentless suffering and submission, there were countless acts of defiance, rebellion, and organized resistance. Within the forests, swamps, and rugged landscapes, secret societies of Black and Native warriors flourished, training enslaved Africans in the ways of guerrilla warfare, survival tactics, and battle strategies. These groups formed bonds that transcended racial lines, built on mutual struggles against European domination. The result was the emergence of fortified communities, strongholds where fugitive slaves became trained fighters, warriors, and even leaders of resistance movements. To understand these secret societies and their impact, one must examine the broader historical context, the cultural exchange between Native and African traditions, and the intricate military tactics that allow them to successfully challenge some of the world's most formidable empires. From the Seminole resistance in Florida to the Maroon rebellions of Jamaica and Suriname, these alliances forged legacies of defiance that continue to inspire the modern struggle for justice and freedom. The presence of enslaved Africans in the Americas dates back to the early 1500s, when European colonizers began forcibly transporting Africans across the Atlantic. As the plantation economy grew, so did the brutality of slavery, leading to widespread efforts by enslaved people to escape. However, the Americas were not just European-controlled territories. Indigenous nations still occupied vast portions of the land, often resisting the encroachment of colonial powers. Fugitive slaves found refuge among indigenous groups who, in many cases, had been victims of European conquest themselves. This mutual struggle against European imperialism created an environment where cooperation flourished. Over time, these alliances grew into organized societies where African escapees integrated into Native communities, adopting their languages, traditions, and military techniques. Among the earliest recorded alliances was that of the Timucua and Guayl tribes in Spanish Florida, who harbored escaped slaves as early as the 17th century. Spanish records indicate that African fugitives settled in native villages, learning to navigate the dense Florida swamps and fight using indigenous warfare tactics. Similarly, in South Carolina and Georgia, the Yamasee and Creek peoples incorporated escaped slaves into their ranks, using them as warriors against British expansion. One of the most remarkable examples of these alliances was the emergence of the Seminole Maroon communities in Florida. The Seminoles, a Native American group composed of various Creek tribes, absorbed thousands of escaped African slaves, granting them refuge and training them as warriors. These Black Seminoles became instrumental in the Seminole Wars, 1816 to 1858, fiercely battling the U.S. government's attempts to force them back into bondage. The secret societies that formed between Black and Native groups were not just passive communities of escapees. They were fortified strongholds of resistance. Fugitive slaves were trained in indigenous warfare, mastering techniques that made them formidable adversaries against colonial militias. Guerrilla warfare became the primary strategy employed by these groups. Unlike European-style combat, which relied on open-field battles, indigenous and Maroon warriors engaged in hit-and-run tactics, using the dense terrain to their advantage. Swamps, forests, and mountains became natural fortresses from which they launched devastating ambushes on enemy forces. Black warriors trained in these societies learned to track movements, set traps, and use silence and darkness as weapons of war. In Florida, Black Seminoles adopted the Seminole practice of irregular warfare. Instead of direct confrontation, they struck isolated military outposts and plantations, freeing more enslaved individuals and retreating before reinforcements could arrive. These tactics frustrated U.S. military commanders, who struggled to suppress their resistance. Similarly, in the Caribbean, Maroon societies in Jamaica and Suriname trained escaped slaves in the arts of combat. The Windward Maroons of Jamaica, led by legendary figures like Queen Nanny, transformed escapees into disciplined warriors capable of holding their own against British forces. Nanny herself was said to have possessed supernatural abilities, using African spiritual traditions to empower her fighters. Through rigorous training, Maroon warriors became adept at firearms, hand-to-hand combat, and psychological warfare, using decoys and misinformation to mislead their enemies. The secret societies that trained enslaved Africans to fight had far-reaching effects, shaping some of the most significant resistance movements in history. The knowledge and skills passed down through these communities empowered enslaved people to mount large-scale revolts that shook the foundations of European colonial rule. One of the most well-documented examples is the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, during which Black Seminoles played a decisive role in resisting U.S. expansion. Led by figures like John Horse and Osceola, these warriors fought relentless battles against the U.S. Army, refusing to surrender even when vastly outnumbered. The war resulted in the forced removal of thousands of Seminoles and Black Seminoles to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, but many continued their resistance even in exile. In South America, the Palenque communities of Colombia and Brazil functioned as military societies, training fugitive slaves in advanced battle tactics. Led by warriors such as Bencos Bioho, these groups launched raids on Spanish settlements, freeing captives and destabilizing the colonial economy. The strength of these secret societies forced European powers to negotiate treaties with Maroon communities, recognizing their autonomy in certain regions. Even in the American colonies, the fear of black native alliances prompted slaveholders to enact stricter laws to prevent enslaved people from fleeing to indigenous territories. The colonial governments of South Carolina and Georgia, for instance, issued bounties on escaped slaves who sought refuge with native tribes, fearing that their knowledge of warfare could inspire mass uprisings. The story of Black native societies that trained enslaved Africans to fight remains one of the most extraordinary yet underappreciated aspects of history. These alliances were more than just acts of survival. They were declarations of defiance against systems of oppression. They provided enslaved Africans with the means to reclaim their agency, resist their oppressors, and, in many cases, change the course of history. By exploring these hidden narratives, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and strategic brilliance of those who refused to accept subjugation. The legacies of these warriors continue to inspire movements for justice and liberation today, reminding us that resistance is woven into the very fabric of history.